and cranes. So thank you to the International Crane Foundation, and thank you to our Whooping Crane Outreach Coordinator. What a fantastic job title, Stephanie Schmidt. So please help me welcome Stephanie.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So like she said, my name is Stephanie Schmidt. I'm the Whooping Crane Outreach Coordinator at the International Crane Foundation. It's a very long title, but it's kind of just a fancy way of saying that I get to talk about whooping cranes every single day in my job. So in this program today, we're going to talk about the cranes that we have here in Wisconsin, our whooping cranes and our Sandhill Cranes. And we're going to talk about a little bit about the International Crane Foundation, give you an idea of who we are, some of the work that we do. I'll give you some tips, tricks, and pointers on how to identify whooping cranes and sandhill cranes by sight and by sound. And then I'll really dive into the history of these species, talking about some of the threats that they faced, where they can be found today, some of the reintroduction efforts we're doing right here in your own backyard with whooping cranes, and then some of the threats that cranes continue to face here in Wisconsin and around North America, and ways that you can help protect cranes in your own community. So to start, the International Crane Foundation, we're sometimes also called ICF because that's a little bit of a mouthful. We work worldwide to conserve cranes in the ecosystems, watersheds, and flyways on which they depend. The International Crane Foundation is headquartered in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and is located within the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people. As an organization, we acknowledge and honor the Ho-Chunk people as caretakers of the land and water since time immemorial, and as our neighbors, friends, and vital members of our community. The International Crane Foundation is dedicated to amplifying local voice and perspective in all of the places where cranes dance. And pictured here are all 15 species of cranes that can be found around the world. And you can see that they share a lot of similar features. The first being that all cranes appear to have very long beaks, small heads, and long necks. And with those sorts of lengthening features, you can probably gather that these birds are relatively tall as well. You can see right there from our life-size poster of a whooping crane that our whooping cranes stand at 5 feet tall. They are not the tallest of all species of cranes, however. The tallest is going to be the Saurus Crane. They're found in India and they stand at 6 feet tall. The shortest of all 15 species is actually the Demoiselle crane right there. They stand at just about 2.5 to 3 feet tall. Despite being the shortest species of crane, they are actually one of the toughest. And on their migration, they fly over the Himalayas. You can also see with these cranes there's a lot of repetition of color. Most of them appear to have some combination of black, white, red, and gray on their face. The only species of crane that doesn't have red on its face is our blue crane, also called the Stanley crane, and as you can see, he is blue. When you take a look at the Demoiselle crane, you may think that it doesn't have red as well, but when the light hits their eye just right, they have this kind of flaming red eye. Cranes also have a lot of diversity between them in that they can be found around the world. You can find cranes on 5 out of 7 continents. The only place that you can't find cranes is going to be South America and Antarctica. And here in North America, we're very lucky to have 2 species of cranes, both of which visit here in Wisconsin. And that's going to be our whooping crane and our Sandhill Crane. So I'd venture to bet here that everybody is at least familiar with the Sandhill Crane. You've maybe seen them, heard or heard of them. They're one of the most common species of crane around the world. There's about 800,000 of them spread out throughout North America. On the very opposite end of the spectrum here in Wisconsin, we also have one of the rarest and most endangered species of cranes, and that's our whooping crane. Compared to around the 800,000 found in the world for Sandhill cranes, there's only 650 wild whooping cranes in the world. Unfortunately for cranes, being listed as threatened or endangered is not uncommon. 10 out of the 15 species of cranes are threatened or endangered, one of them again being our whooping crane. And they face various threats around the world, threats of illegal poaching, the illegal pet trade, loss of their habitat. All 15 species of cranes are dependent on wetlands to some degree. They're also dependent on prairies as well. And with wetlands and prairies being some of the most threatened habitats around the world, it stands to reason that these very wetland-dependent or prairie-dependent species are going to be impacted by that as well. But again today, we're just going to talk about that very common Sandhill crane and the endangered whooping crane. And before we dive into the history of these species, I always like to take a step back and really familiarize you with them. And when we talk about Sandhill cranes, they're also called Grus canadensis, that's their Latin name. It's always important to start with what they sound like before you start talking about what they look like. Because with Sandhill cranes, you're often going to hear them for a long time before you see them, because their calls can carry for miles. And you may be very familiar with their call. It carries kind of a rattling characteristic to it. Some equate it to that of a modern-day pterodactyl. The reason their call rattles or makes this kind of rattling karoo is because they have a curve in their trachea. So when the sound is coming out, it actually starts bouncing, and it makes that very distinct rattle. So I'm going to play two calls for you right now. The first is a guard call. You're probably much more familiar with this one. This is a call they'll make when they're in flight. They're going to really start picking up and making this call here soon as they head out in their migration, starting in mid-October, peaking in November, and then going through around mid-December. You will know that some Sandhill Cranes here in the Dane County area actually don't migrate, so you might actually hear this call throughout the entire winter as well. But I'll play this for you now. All right, and the next call that we have here, this is a unison call. This is kind of described as an overlapping cacophony of sounds. It's two birds that are in a bonded pair, and they're calling at the same time. One's calling, one's responding, but they're kind of overlapping with each other just a little bit. And they're typically going to make this call when they have chicks on the ground or when they're breeding. So between about June to September, you can hear this call. They will make it in the winter, not very frequently though. You're typically just going to hear that guard call throughout the winter and migration. But I'll play this unison call for you now. Sandhill Cranes also have a very distinct look to them. They stand at about 4 feet tall. They have an impressive wingspan. They have very long black legs. You can see when they're in flight, that long neck is going to be stretched out in front of them. You can see they have a featherless red patch on the crown of their head. They have this kind of orangish amber eye and a very long, sharp black beak. You can also see throughout their entire body and wings, they appear to have kind of a slate gray or a reddish brown color. So oftentimes here in Wisconsin, we get asked, well, what about the red Sandhill Cranes? What about the gray Sandhill Cranes? Do we have two different subspecies here? Are we seeing a breeding plumage and a non-breeding plumage? And the answer is a little stranger than you might think. And I'm going to show you a close-up of their feathers in just a moment. But I want you to notice on this crane how it's gray up until about halfway down its neck, and then it starts to get that sort of mottled brown color to it. So when you look at Sandhill Crane feathers up close, you'll see that you have some gray ones and you have some red ones as well. We have our red Sandhill Cranes up top and then those distinct gray ones right there on the bottom. So when Sandhill Cranes are returning to Wisconsin in the spring, they're coming back in the very early spring. They're coming back around March and they're returning to wetlands. And at that time, our wetlands aren't this sort of lush green cattail that they are in the summer. Instead, they're going to be this sort of dead brown kind of color. And at this time, our Sandhill Cranes are going to immediately start establishing territories, breeding, building a nest, laying eggs, and raising chicks, all before that cattail turns kind of that prominent green color. So in order to better survive in this sort of environment and have their nest survive and their chicks survive, they need to camouflage. So Sandhill Cranes will actually take mud from the wetland and they'll paint it on their feathers. And when that mud hits the air, it oxidizes because it's very rich in iron, and it stains these feathers kind of this reddish color. So you can see that the feathers that look a little bit more tattered or worn, those are the ones that are red, versus the ones that appear very crisp and new. Those are feathers that have recently come in and they haven't been painted yet, and those are gray. Typically we'll see these gray Sandhill Cranes because these are non-breeding individuals, so they haven't yet hit breeding age. There's no need for them to paint or camouflage, whereas these are adults that have started breeding and they do want to camouflage. If you see Sandhill Cranes in places like Florida, or maybe in Mississippi, you might notice that there's no red Sandhill Cranes there. And the reason for that is they don't need to camouflage with brown. There's not really going to be a brown environment for them, so they actually aren't painting their feathers down there. So it's pretty unique to the Wisconsin area. The next crane that we have here in Wisconsin is our whooping crane, also called Grus americana. Just like with the Sandhill Crane, we'll talk about what they sound like and then move into what they look like. The whooping crane gets its name, the whooping crane, because it has a very distinct whooping-like call. So instead of that rattle that we hear with the Sandhill Crane, we hear kind of a shout or a bugle straight from our whooping crane. So I'll play this guard call now. I think of it as kind of a single note yell, and you're going to hear one bird call and then one respond. And our next call that we have here, I apologize if it's a little loud. This one can be a little hard to control. But this is that unison call again, that overlapping cacophony of sounds. And for whooping cranes, they really get into it. They really get loud, and this is where you can hear that whooping sort of characteristic. Whoop. I skipped ahead there. So whooping cranes, again, they stand at 5 feet tall. This makes them North America's tallest bird. They have this distinct white throughout their entire body. They also have long black legs, this long neck. On the top of their head, they have a featherless red patch on their crown. And they also have this very distinct black mustache-like mask on their cheeks. They have a bright yellow eye and a grayish yellow beak. You also notice with this whooping crane that it's standing in a wetland. Whooping cranes are far more wetland dependent than our Sandhill cranes for a variety of reasons. One of them being, though, that while our Sandhill cranes can camouflage with mud, our whooping cranes can't. They're a very large, bright white bird, and one way that they can stay safe from predators is by getting into deeper water, so they can get away from those animals like coyotes, raccoons, foxes, animals that typically are deterred by deeper water. When in flight, we'll see that our whooping cranes will also fly with that long neck outstretched in front of them and those long legs trailing behind them. They have a massive 8-foot wingspan, and when they pop their wings open, you see these very prominent black wingtips. Having black wingtips for a large white bird like the whooping crane is incredibly advantageous to their survival. You'll see that many large white birds also have black wingtips. And that's because when you're on migration and you're flapping your wings, the feathers that undergo the most wear and tear are the ones right at the tip. And the darker the feather is, the more melanin it has in it, the stronger it is, the less likely it is to break. So you'll see many large white birds do have these distinct black wingtips. Unfortunately, that makes it a little bit hard when you're trying to identify a whooping crane because you may see some other large white birds with distinct black wingtips. And these are some of the birds that are most commonly mistaken for whooping cranes. The one that I hear most frequently here in Wisconsin is probably the American white pelican. So looking at it right here versus looking at our whooping crane, you may be wondering, how do these two birds get mistaken? One has very long legs, the other has short legs. One has a long neck, the other one clearly has a short neck and just a long beak. Well, the thing is that pelicans and whooping cranes, they both fly very, very high up in the sky. And the higher up you get, the harder it is to see that neck and those legs. They're very skinny, they start to disappear, and you just see a white body and black wings. So one tip that I use for identifying whooping cranes from pelicans is that pelicans have black on their wingtips, but then it also runs all the way along the underside of their wing, whereas our whooping cranes, it just stays at the tip. Another quick way to tell them apart is that pelicans form massive flocks. You can see hundreds of pelicans at one time. There's only around 80 whooping cranes here in Wisconsin, and you're never going to see all 80 together. At most, you're going to see about 4 whooping cranes together at one time because they're just going to stay in that family unit. So that's another quick way to tell them apart. You can also see some other birds like the snow goose. It has shorter legs. It's a smaller bird. Our egrets and our herons, they're also long-legged wading birds. But one way to tell them apart in flight is they fly with their neck coiled into an S, whereas our cranes hold that kind of stretched out. We also often get asked for our cranes, do they nest in trees? I saw a very long-legged, long-necked bird that was in a wetland, and then it hopped up into a tree and it built a nest up there. Unfortunately, those are not our cranes, and it has to do with their anatomy of their feet. So I have right here a replica of one of their feet. You'll see that our cranes have really long front legs, and they have this itty-bitty back toe. With feet like that, you can't perch in trees. You'll see here, if you look at our great blue heron, he has really long front toes and a really long back toe. So if you see a long-legged, long-necked bird that goes from the ground into a tree, it's probably a heron or an egret because they can perch, but our cranes are really just restricted to being standing on the ground or in flight. Another bird, of course, that we have that's commonly mistaken for a whooping crane is, of course, our Sandhill Crane. They're so closely related, they share a lot of similar features. Sometimes we refer to them as cousins here in Wisconsin. But another quick way to tell them apart is whooping cranes are white with black, and Sandhill cranes are sort of a gray or red throughout their entire body, and it's going to be the same color throughout. So before we dive into the history of these species and talk about where they're found here in Wisconsin, I do want to do just a very short poll to see if anybody here has seen a whooping crane or a Sandhill crane, and you can just vote by raising your hand. So has anyone here seen a Sandhill crane? Awesome, absolutely. And has anybody here seen a whooping crane? Just a few. That's really exciting. Awesome. Well, hopefully you have your ID guides now. We've talked about what they look like. You can keep your eyes peeled, and maybe we can get a few more people seeing whooping cranes here in Wisconsin. Let's talk a little bit about the history of these cranes, starting first with the Sandhill Crane, and I like to call the Sandhill Crane a conservation success story. So in the 1940s, Sandhill Cranes were almost completely extirpated from the east of the Mississippi River, so much so that this scene that we see right here, a marsh without cranes in it, unfortunately became common. At this time, although Leopold, he believed that cranes could be completely lost from the Midwest altogether, and he wrote here in Marshland Elegy saying, "The sadness discernible in some marshes arises, perhaps from their once having harbored cranes. Now they stand humbled, adrift in history." Unfortunately, Sandhill cranes are very quickly lost from the landscape here in Wisconsin, ultimately due to unregulated habitat loss and unregulated hunting of these Sandhill cranes, and this had a huge impact on our Sandhill cranes simply because of their life history. At this time, it was estimated that there were only about 25 breeding pairs of Sandhill cranes left here in Wisconsin. That's a huge contrast from the 20,000 Sandhill cranes we see here in Wisconsin today, and they were completely lost from some other eastern states like Iowa, Indiana, and Ohio. So when talking about the life history of Sandhill cranes, it's really important to note that this life history is not unique to Sandhill cranes. It applies to all 15 species of cranes, including our endangered whooping crane. So the first thing to know about sandhills, or cranes in general, is they're an incredibly long-lived species. In the wild, Sandhill cranes have been documented living into their 30s, and in captivity, they can live to be much older. At the International Crane Foundation, we once cared for a Siberian crane. His name was Wolf, and he lived to be 83 years old. So on top of being an incredibly long-lived species, they are also very, very slow to reproduce. They're typically just going to lay about 1 to 2 eggs each year. They'll sit on those eggs for about 30 days. Oftentimes, they will hatch just one chick called a colt. Sometimes we'll see 2 and we'll call them twins, but they're going to raise that one colt through the summer. That colt is not going to learn to fly or fledge until it's about 80 days old. It's then going to stay with its parents on its first migration down south in the fall. It's going to spend the winter with them, and it's going to come right back up in the spring, at which point the parents are going to build a territory and they're going to kick their chick off, and that chick's going to join other non-breeding individuals and form kind of a juvenile bachelor flock for quite a few years until it's about 3 to 5 years old, at which point it's going to find one other bird that it's going to breed with for the rest of its life and fall right back into this slow reproductive cycle, laying 1 to 2 eggs each year, hatching just one chick, sometimes 2, and that chick not breeding until it's about 3 to 5 years old. So animals with these sorts of life characteristics, being very long-lived, slow to reproduce, and laying very small clutches, it's very hard for this population to rebuild after they sustain significant losses to their populations. But I did say that Sandhill cranes are a conservation success story, so you may be wondering where they are now. As I said before, there's an estimated 800,000 Sandhill cranes throughout all of North America. East of the Mississippi, where we live, there's about 90,000, and about 20,000 come through Wisconsin every single year. And as you can see from this map here, they have a massive range, and that range is continuing to expand east, hopefully to cover all of North America one day. And today, Sandhill cranes exist across 6 different populations. The first are the 3 migratory. So we have the lesser Sandhill crane, the Canadian, and the greater. Here in Wisconsin, we see the greater Sandhill crane. And then there's also 3 subspecies of non-migratory Sandhill cranes, and that's going to be our Cuban, which just live in Cuba, our Florida in Florida, and our Mississippi right there in Mississippi. So despite being not federally listed as a species and considered to be relatively common, that doesn't mean that all populations of Sandhill cranes are stable. 2 of our non-migratory populations are actually listed as endangered. Our Mississippi and our Cuban populations are endangered. And some of our crane conservation partners, they're working on a reintroduction program for those Mississippi Sandhill cranes that's incredibly similar to what we do with whooping cranes right here in Wisconsin. In addition to that, our Florida population of non-migratory Sandhill cranes, we've been seeing that population slowly decrease throughout the year. And in some western states for Sandhill cranes are actually listed as state threatened. So in places like California, Sandhill cranes are considered to be state threatened. But again, focusing in on the one that we see here in Wisconsin, that's going to be the greater Sandhill crane. And the greater Sandhill crane is considered to be incredibly common, which is really due in part to their adaptability to an agricultural landscape. And as we know, living here in Wisconsin, one of the predominant landscape types that we have is that agricultural landscape. So they're really making use of what is available to them. And Sandhill cranes are found in those agricultural landscapes. They're found in those wetlands because both of these landscape types are both flat. They provide ample access to food resources, and they both can flood, which gives them access to that water that they need. But having Sandhill Cranes on an agricultural landscape is not necessarily a win-win for everybody, and they've actually become quite a pest in some of these locations. So in the springtime, when Sandhill Cranes return to Wisconsin, a lot of them are returning to these agricultural fields to start foraging and make up for all the energy that was lost on migration. And at this time, some of our corn farmers, they've recently planted their corn seed, and that corn has sprouted just a little bit of green out of it, but that very carbohydrate-rich and tasty corn kernel that was planted, it hasn't dissolved yet into a root nodule. It's still sitting down there, and it essentially has a little green flag saying that there's a treat right here. So our Sandhill Cranes, they return to Wisconsin, and they start plucking that corn seed right out in a line. And of course, this is not advantageous to corn farmers here in Wisconsin. So the International Crane Foundation, we've been working very closely with other scientists, and we've helped to create something called Avapel. Avapel is a bird repellent seed treatment. Essentially, it's a taste deterrent. It's coated onto that corn seed right before it's planted, so that if Sandhill Cranes pick it up and eat it, it tastes very bad and they don't return to this field to continue foraging. It is scientifically proven to greatly reduce crop depredation by cranes, and it's an option that we endorse if this is an issue that you're facing with crop depredation on your cornfields. Again, despite being very common here in Wisconsin and even causing a bit of human-wildlife conflicts here in Wisconsin, we are also learning that Sandhill Cranes continue to face threats that could impact their future here in our state and across North America. The first being, again, that they are endangered in some of their populations, they're state threatened in other areas in North America, and we're seeing some populations of Sandhill Cranes are declining. Sandhill Cranes also continue to be threatened by the expansion of legal Sandhill Crane hunting seasons. So hunting of Sandhill Cranes is currently legal in 17 states throughout the United States. And here in the eastern population that comes right through Wisconsin, there's legal hunting of Sandhill Cranes in some of their wintering habitats in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Alabama. And there's discussions for a legal Sandhill Crane hunting season here in Wisconsin on their breeding grounds. That's something that we don't support as an organization for a variety of reasons. One of them being that having a hunting season in the wintering grounds and having a hunting season on the breeding grounds, the impacts of that are relatively unknown at this time and could be very detrimental. And as we know from the life history of our Sandhill Cranes, being very long-lived, slow to reproduce, and laying small clutches, it's incredibly hard for that population to bounce back from substantial losses to them. Some additional threats to our Sandhill Cranes include continued habitat loss from urban expansion, land conversion to agriculture. Despite using agricultural landscapes to feed, our Sandhill Cranes do need to return to wetlands or to riverbank edges at night so they can roost in that water, so they can get that additional protection from those predators that deeper water can afford. Sandhill Cranes also continue to be threatened by challenges to the Clean Water Act, and they're also threatened by the expansion of high voltage lines, which can create a collision risk, and they're threatened by the creation of some of these wind farms if these wind farms are being placed in areas that result in habitat loss to Sandhill Cranes. One large question we always get asked is if these wind turbines place a collision risk on our Sandhill Cranes. And ultimately the answer is largely no. We see for a lot of other birds and bats that wind turbines can create a risk for them. We aren't typically seeing that with our Sandhill Cranes. For them, the risk is mostly habitat loss or the high voltage lines that are associated with some of these projects as well. So it's really the location of where they're being built, not necessarily the existence of them. When talking about these threats, it's also really important to note these threats are, again, not unique to our Sandhill Cranes. They apply to many other species across Wisconsin and across North America, one of them, again, being our endangered whooping crane. So that leads us into our whooping crane, which I like to call a story of perseverance, cooperation, and creativity, as this is a conservation effort that is still being played out on our landscape. So pre-European expansion, whooping cranes would have had a massive range. As you can see from this map, they would have been breeding as far north as the Arctic, coming through Wisconsin here, migrating really through the bulk of the United States, and then spending their winters in central Mexico and coastal Gulf of Mexico area. At this time, it was predicted that there were over 10,000 whooping cranes in the fertile wetlands and prairies of North America, but by the 1940s, there were only 20 whooping cranes left in the wild, and they faced near extinction at this point. And you may be wondering what contributed to the decline of whooping cranes, and unfortunately, there were many, many factors that contributed to their decline, but I'll just talk about the four major ones here. The first one being unregulated hunting. As you can see from this image of a man who has shot a whooping crane he has on display, and a Sandhill Crane is above that as well. So unfortunately, when European settlers moved into these areas in North America, these lush wetlands and prairies that our whooping cranes and many other species were using, these areas were full of resources, but at this time, game laws were mostly ignored and they were rarely enforced. So this really led to unrestrained hunting and destruction of wild spaces that ultimately grew into the 1800s and led to the extinction of many species we could have seen today. One of them that we would have seen here in Wisconsin that was lost due to unregulated hunting was the passenger pigeon. Whooping cranes could have fallen along a very similar fate. Unfortunately, as whooping cranes became more scarce as a result of this unregulated hunting, their value increased. And with that increase in value, we see not only an increase in hunting, but also an increase in egg collecting simply for the value of the eggs. As we know from the life history of whooping cranes, long-lived, slow to reproduce, laying very small clutches, this is a very bad combo for the survival of the species. We're losing breeding adults from the population, and those that can breed, their eggs are being taken off of their nests. So the population's falling and it doesn't have a chance to rebuild. Some other factors that contributed to the decline of whooping cranes include the millinery trade. The millinery trade was essentially the trade for wild bird feathers, which at this time were used to adorn women's hats for fashion. And some of the most sought after bird feathers were those of very colorful birds, or unfortunately those of very large white birds like our whooping crane, that could make impressive plumes like the one pictured here. But luckily for whooping cranes and the many birds that we continue to see today, some high society women from Boston, they noticed this issue and they formed the very first Audubon Society, which was the Massachusetts Audubon Society, and this essentially banned the trade of wild bird feathers and protected the many birds we still see today. Finally, habitat loss was a major factor contributing to the decline of whooping cranes, and this was largely driven by the Homestead Act of the 1860s. This act essentially encouraged people to rapidly move out west, and in doing so convert hundreds of thousands of acres of those fertile wetlands and prairies that our whooping cranes depended on into that predominantly agricultural landscape that we see today. But, oops. Let me quick click through this. Just kicked me out all of a sudden. All right, we are back. But luckily for our whooping cranes and for the many species we see today, when people notice not only the decline of whooping cranes, but the loss of common species and wild spaces resulted in a series of laws to protect all of these species and spaces. The first is in 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This essentially prohibits the illegal take of birds. It's an incredibly important piece of legislation still used today. It prevents the illegal hunting of birds, taking of their eggs, taking of their nests, taking of their feathers, some of those huge factors that impacted our whooping cranes. In 1934, we saw the creation of the Duck Stamp Act. If you're familiar with wetlands, you might be a waterfowl hunter yourself, you may be familiar with the Duck Stamp Act. It still exists today. It's essentially a federal art competition to design this stamp that is then sold to hunters to hunt on federal lands. Today, it's raised over $850 million to protect 6.5 million acres of wildlife habitat. In 1966, we saw the creation of the Refuge System. This is incredibly important for our whooping cranes to protect all of these large expanses of wetland for them to use, because our whooping cranes, they use massive habitats. A whooping crane territory can be about 1,000 acres in size, so they really depend on this refuge land to have that habitat to defend. In 1972, we saw the passage of the Clean Water Act, also incredibly important for our whooping cranes because it protects those wetland habitats they depend on. And then finally in 1973, the passage of the Endangered Species Act. At this time, there were only around 70 whooping cranes left in the wild, and they were immediately listed as endangered. Whooping cranes are currently still listed as endangered despite their populations having grown, but none of the currently existing populations of whooping cranes are technically at the point of being self-sustaining, or at the point where they're not dependent on the International Crane Foundation and our crane conservation partners to continue to put birds out in the landscape and have kind of a heavy hand in the continued management and monitoring of these species and the spaces that they use. Our goal, of course, is for whooping cranes to eventually be removed from the endangered species list and become a common species we have here in Wisconsin and across North America. And our populations are growing, and we're still getting closer and closer to that goal, but we're not at that point just yet. Today, whooping cranes, they exist across 4 distinct populations, the first of which is known as the wood buffalo Marancis population. This is what is left of our historic flock. So if you remember that massive map we looked at before where they were breeding as far north as the Arctic and wintering in central Mexico. That population that went from 10,000 to 20, it now has been reduced to a single flyway. They'll spend their summers up at Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada, where they're going to breed, and then they'll migrate through the central flyway and spend their winters at Marancis National Wildlife Refuge in coastal Texas. In the 1990s, we started our first whooping crane reintroduction effort with a non-migratory flock that lives in Florida. In 2001, we started our first migratory flock reintroduction right here in Wisconsin. That population is known as the Eastern Migratory Population, or the EMP. They are up here right now in Wisconsin, wrapping up their breeding season. Well, they're done breeding. They're wrapping up, I guess, kind of their chick rearing season at this point. And they're going to head down in around mid-October to make their way down through their migration path. So that population you might have heard about as being the one that was raised using an airplane. That's how they were taught their migration path, leaving Wisconsin, heading all the way down to Florida. That was discontinued in 2016. We do still continue to release birds in that population, but we have enough whooping cranes in that population now that we just release them next to other whooping cranes, and they'll teach them their migration path down. So we don't continue to use the airplane, but we are still continuing to do releases. And we found very quickly that the whooping cranes did not want to go as far south as Florida anymore. And many of them have decided that they're going to spend their winters in northern Alabama, and some of them in western Indiana as well. Our most recent reintroduction was in 2011, and that's our non-migratory Louisiana flock, and that one's continuing to grow as well. But today, again, we're just going to focus on that reintroduced Eastern Migratory Population, or the EMP, as that's, again, the one that we see right here in Wisconsin. So the Eastern Migratory Population, or again, the EMP, they're a completely reintroduced population of whooping cranes, and they were started when birds hatched and raised in captivity were then released out into the wild. This process is, again, still used today to continue to grow that population, as it's also not self-sustaining. And there are really many steps to this process, but for simplicity's sake, the first step is going to be breeding the birds in captivity. And that's what 2 of our biologists are doing right there. It's incredibly important that we breed these birds in captivity because whooping cranes have this very fun life trait, just like our Sandhill Cranes, in that they mate for life. And when you're talking about a population that went from 10,000 down to 20, you're talking about a population that lost a ton of genetic diversity. And if you want healthy wild populations and healthy captive populations, you need to introduce genetic diversity. So in captivity, our birds, they maintain social partnerships. So they live with other birds, they dance with them, they build nests with them, they lay eggs with them and raise chicks with them. But that's not necessarily the bird that they're breeding with year after year. And that's one way that we can help create healthy populations out in the wild. But once these birds are bred, they then lay eggs. Those eggs are incubated for about 30 days. And then the chicks that hatch from them are raised using 2 very different methods. So the first method that we use is called parent rearing. It's probably the most obvious and the most natural. This is where we have 2 very strong adult whooping cranes that have proven they can be good parents. And they're going to raise this chick, teach them everything they need to know about how to survive in the wild, and eventually that chick is released out in the wild. Unfortunately, we are oftentimes hatching and raising more chicks in captivity than we have adults that can raise them. So this is where we need to get creative, and this is where costume rearing comes in. And pictured here is the costume that's often used to raise whooping cranes. And it does look very ridiculous at first glance, but it is really necessary to raise whooping cranes to be released out into the wild. And that's because whooping cranes have another fun life history trait in that they imprint. Imprinting is essentially a rapid learning process where a young bird learns their identity by looking at who is raising them. So if you raise a whooping crane looking, sounding, acting, and talking like a human being, that whooping crane is not going to learn its identity as that of a whooping crane. So instead we employ these very ridiculous costumes, but when you break them down, you start to see the anatomy of a whooping crane. And I had someone point out to me one time, when you think about the size of a chick versus the size of the costume and kind of think about it leaning forward, it looks more and more like a whooping crane than what we're kind of seeing just standing right here. But breaking it down, all of your body is covered by this white kind of cloth covering your body. That makes that large white body of the whooping crane and also gives you the height of a whooping crane. Their left arm is going to act as their wing, so they're going to have that tucked most of the time, but when they want to flap it, they'll pop it out and you see those prominent black wing tips. And then their right arm is going to act as that very long white neck, and at the top they have a puppet head right there. And on the puppet head, they have a featherless red patch on the crown, that black mustache-like mask, that bright yellow eye, and that grayish yellow beak. But looking like a whooping crane is not enough. Our biologists also need to act like whooping cranes. So they spend a lot of time out in the wild observing natural whooping crane behaviors, so doing things like preening their feathers, or foraging on the ground, or drinking water, or doing things like running and flapping their wings, so they can teach these young birds how to fly. I actually have up here one of the puppet heads if you would like to give it a try after the program and see kind of what it looks like. But on top of acting like a whooping crane, finally they need to sound like a whooping crane. Because our whooping crane chicks, they can imprint on sound too. They can actually imprint as early as when they're in the egg. So when these eggs are being incubated, we also have to be very careful to not talk around them. So our biologists, when they're raising the chicks, they're not speaking to each other. Instead, they're broadcasting this very soft kind of purring contact call. And this isn't a call that you're going to hear out in the wild. You'd have to get very close to the birds. But it does sound like a purr, and it's a call that a whooping crane would make when talking with their egg or when talking with their chick, and it's thought of as kind of a reassuring sound. So I'll play that one for you now. So once the whooping crane chicks are raised, either by other adult whooping cranes or by these costumes, it's now time for them to be released out into the wild. And we use many different release options for bringing these birds out into the wild here in Wisconsin, but the one that's pictured right here, and the one that's most often used this year, is going to be a soft release. This is where we build a temporary pen in a wild wetland. The birds are put in that pen, they're given time to acclimate with it, and then over time the pen is slowly taken apart until these birds are completely out in the wild and then ready to head down on their migration. So this entire process of breeding, hatching, raising, and releasing a whooping crane chick into the wild, as you can imagine, is very time-consuming. It's also incredibly expensive. The cost of raising and releasing one whooping crane chick here in the wild in Wisconsin is about $100,000 per bird. But it was a very necessary process, again, to bring this endangered species back to Wisconsin, to build another flock, and then hopefully get the species off the endangered species list. But once they are in the wild, our work is not done. We, of course, need to continue to monitor these birds so we can learn a lot of information about them. This population was just released first in 2001, and being very long-lived and slow to reproduce, we need to get many, many, many years of data on these birds to understand really the long-term survival and success of this reintroduced population. And one way that we keep track of these birds and understand the movements that they're making, the other birds are associating with, if they're hatching and raising chicks, is through these colorful bands on their legs. And these colorful bands are often called their crane jewelry, and they essentially act as a name tag. Each bird is going to get a unique combination, so that bird there would be the only one that has white, green, red on their left leg and white, red on their right leg. And we have biologists and staff who help us to track these birds, either by spotting these color bands or by also picking up the signal from some radio tags on them. So you'll see that crane right on the far end there, they have what looks kind of like a stick or an antenna coming off of their leg. This is a radio tag. Each bird that's given one has a unique frequency. You tune to that frequency like you would a radio, put up this antenna, and you'll pick up a beeping sound, and it helps you to find exactly where the bird is at. Unfortunately, though, we have very limited numbers. These birds have a massive migratory range, so we do really depend on sightings and reports from citizen scientists or people who are outside and likely to encounter these whooping cranes. So we ask that if you spot whooping cranes out in the wild, that you let us know where you spotted them. This is incredibly valuable information for us to continue to protect these birds here in Wisconsin. So I have here just some quick steps for reporting sighting of a whooping crane. First, confirm that you saw a whooping crane. So I talked about all of those birds that look very similar to them, so just make sure that your identification is correct. Then you can head to the whoopermap.savingcranes.org, and this is what the landing page looks like. You can see all of the recent locations where whooping crane sightings have been reported. You can see that it's just showing the county where they're found. So because they are an endangered species, their exact location is kept private so that we can help better protect these birds. So we ask that if you spot whooping cranes and you want to tell your friends on social media or tell your friends and family about it, please just share the county that they're found in. This helps us to keep them safe. But when it comes to reporting your sighting to us, we ask that you report your sighting at bandedcranes.org and share with us the exact location that you saw this bird. Even if you didn't see bands on the bird, letting us know that a whooping crane is there gives us the opportunity to send biologists out to spot those bands and get an idea of the identity of the bird. But if you do spot their bands or do happen to get a picture of them, please feel free to upload it on there. All of that information helps us to keep track of these birds and save this endangered species in your own state. But today, across all of the wild and captive flocks of whooping cranes, there are about 800 birds. About 650 of them live in captivity, and about 650 live in the wild. About 136 live in captivity. Not all of those whooping cranes live at the International Crane Foundation. We have around 30 of them at the International Crane Foundation. But we have a lot of other crane conservation partners that help us with this reintroduction program. So places like the Calgary Zoo in Canada, the Audubon Zoo in New Orleans, and even as close as the Milwaukee County Zoo right in Milwaukee. They help us with our reintroduction effort by also hatching and raising whooping cranes in captivity that are then going to be released in the wild. And then across our wild populations, we have around 500 in that historic population, around 80 in our Wisconsin population, and around 72 in our Louisiana population, and only around 7 in our Florida non-migratory population. So we've actually stopped reintroduction efforts in this Florida population because we very quickly found out that we were releasing birds in places that had unstable habitat and a very high risk of bobcat predation. And at about $100,000 per bird, that's a pretty hefty meal ticket for a bobcat, and it wasn't conducive to the long-term conservation of the species. So moving forward, we are just focusing our efforts on the Wisconsin population and the Louisiana one as well. But in just about 70 years, we've really seen a significant recovery of the species, and the story is really proof that by working together, scientists, governments, and communities can really save a species from the brink of extinction. Unfortunately, however, our work is not done. Whooping cranes are continuing to face massive threats throughout North America, and especially here in our reintroduced eastern migratory population. And two of the largest threats they continue to face are those of power line collisions and poaching. And we'll start first with power line collisions. So a 2008 report by researchers from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Texas State University, they found that power line collisions are the #1 known cause of mortality for recently fledged migratory whooping cranes. So because of this, crane conservation organizations, they've worked very closely with power companies to suggest alternative strategies to decrease these incidences of whooping crane collisions. The first being burying power lines in areas that whooping cranes are flying closer to the ground. So we know in migration, our birds are typically very high up in the sky, so it's not every power line that poses a risk, but whooping cranes and Sandhill cranes, they have very predictable spaces that they come down on their migration. And it's at that point that they're much more likely to collide with these power lines. Their eyes are on the side of their head, it's harder for them to see that thin line in front of them. They're a little bit more tired. They're coming down when it's darker, so it might be coming close to nighttime, or they're taking off when it's darker as well. And this is when that collision risk is most likely to happen. If it's not possible for power lines to be buried, we also suggest alternative strategies like marking these power lines with some of these highly visible, highly reflective tags. They can be attached right to the power line. Some of them glow in the dark. They move, they reflect, and they make it just much more visible for these whooping cranes and these Sandhill cranes, so they're less likely to collide with them. Another unfortunate cause of whooping crane mortalities is whooping crane deaths by gunshot or poaching. So up until the late 90s, there was just one population of whooping cranes, that historic one right there in yellow. And then we saw the Florida population come in, our eastern one, and then finally our Louisiana one. And following the reintroduction of these programs, these populations, we unfortunately saw a massive increase in the number of whooping crane deaths by gunshot. And most of them do appear to be occurring in these reintroduced populations. It's also important to note that in our eastern migratory population, we're seeing shootings of whooping cranes across the entire flyway, occurring in 7 states, including some of our large stopover states for whooping cranes like Wisconsin, Indiana, and Alabama. So as an organization that's working to address this issue of poaching and to safeguard the future here of whooping cranes in Wisconsin and across North America, we wanted to know why this was happening, who is causing this issue. And what we found was that in a large majority of these poaching incidents, these cases are not tied to hunters or hunting incidents or cases of mistaken ID by hunters. More often than not, we're seeing that these are actually things that are occurring due to vandals in the area. So this situation here, or this picture, unfortunately represents a typical instance in which a whooping crane poaching might occur. You can see that these birds are highly visible. You can see them from the road. They're on private property. And more often than not, whooping cranes are being shot from the roadside, sometimes even from inside of vehicles using high-powered rifles. The entire act is highly illegal, and the person committing this act is considered to be a vandal, not a hunter who made an honest mistake. And one of the poaching incidents that we know about was committed by a man named G Blatchford. He was a 25-year-old man in South Dakota, and in 2012 he shot an adult male whooping crane and a hawk. And when asked about shooting these birds, he said he did this sort of thing all the time. He admitted to shooting hawks off of power lines and shooting ducks in ditches, but then he said to us, "I've never shot an eagle." And that's a very interesting response because nobody asked him if he had shot an eagle, but he wanted people to know that wasn't something he would do. And there's really two reasons why he might have said that. The first being that he might be aware of the pride his country, his community, his family has in eagles, seeing as it is our nation's bird. And he also may be aware you can get into a lot of trouble for shooting eagles because they're protected under that Migratory Bird Treaty Act and also the Golden and Bald Eagle Protection Act. So this pride and this awareness of penalties that exists for eagles and really aids in their protection here in North America doesn't necessarily exist for whooping cranes today, but could be very pivotal to their protections moving forward. So in 2015, the International Crane Foundation, we attended a workshop on situational crime prevention. This is oftentimes used in law enforcement, but in this instance, it was used to address wildlife crimes, the wildlife crime again being poaching. And situational crime prevention states that these three instances need to align in order for a crime to occur. You need to have an attractive target or crime victim, that's going to be our whooping crane. You need a motivated offender, that's going to be our poacher. And then finally, you need a lack of guardianship, or that lack of pride in the community and that lack of awareness of penalties that exists for our eagles, and again would be really pivotal to protecting our whooping cranes. We also learned that if you take just one of these factors out, you can greatly reduce the likelihood that a crime will occur. So the International Crane Foundation, we've been addressing this lack of guardianship through our outreach programs throughout the communities where whooping cranes or even Sandhill Cranes may live. And ultimately, we're doing that by working very closely with a variety of audiences that may interact with whooping cranes, the first being K through 12 audiences. Unfortunately, the average age of a whooping crane poacher is just 26 years old, so you need to make sure that youth are aware of whooping cranes, understand what they look like, where they're found, understand their importance and the community pride around these whooping cranes. We're also working very closely with community organizations as we can find very wonderful potential advocates within these organizations. We're working very closely with hunters, with outdoor recreationists, birders, naturalists, people who are already outside, as these people are much more likely to encounter whooping cranes. And we want to provide them with all of the best resources to make safe decisions around them. And we're also asking them to be our eyes and ears on the ground for reporting any sort of poaching or harassment of whooping cranes that could be pivotal to their protection. And then finally, we're working very closely with law enforcement and with the judicial system so we can hold poachers accountable when there are instances of whooping crane poachings. One of our most popular handouts that we use in our outreach program is our Large Water Birds ID Guide, and there are a few of them at the front, and some of you may have grabbed them. This ID guide is really helpful for identifying adult whooping cranes, juveniles, Sandhill cranes, and some of those species that look similar to them. Inside of the ID guide, it also has those phone numbers that are anonymous tip lines within some of the states that whooping cranes live. And those anonymous tip lines can be called to report any sort of poaching and harassment of whooping cranes. It's also important to note that those numbers are not unique to whooping cranes. They're pulled from the state's website. So if you see any sort of poaching or harassment of any wildlife, you can use those phone numbers as well. And it also has information on where to report your sightings of banded cranes as well, so you can help to keep track of these birds with us. And it's a perfect little wallet size to have on you at all times. Our other very popular handout is our I Give a Whoop sticker. These are incredibly important for instilling that community pride and also helping to spread the image of what a whooping crane looks like. So you can see, of course, we have that red head and that very distinct black mustache and a very prominent saying that I give a whoop about whooping cranes, letting people know that you care about them and you want them here in your community for the time being. So you may be wondering, what can I do to help cranes here in Wisconsin? And fortunately, there are many ways that you can help cranes here in Wisconsin. We like to say that you can help them by being a crane hero. And some of the ways you can be a crane hero are listed out here. The first being know how to identify cranes and safely look for them on the landscape. So in looking for cranes, we always ask you remember to give these birds their space, especially our endangered whooping cranes. We always ask you stay at least 2 football fields or 200 yards away from them at all times, not just for the bird safety, but for your own safety as well. These are incredibly tall birds. They are very territorial, and they will not turn down a fight. We also ask that when safely looking for them out on the landscape, you remember to stay on the trail, respect private property, park in designated parking areas, and observe the bird's behavior. If they have their head up and their wings back, they're telling you to take a step back and they're feeling very stressed out. When spotting these birds out in the wild, we also ask that if you see banded cranes, report that to bandedcranes.org, and if you see any sort of poaching or harassment, report that to local authorities. You can also protect cranes by talking to your friends and legislators about cranes here in Wisconsin and advocating for greater wetland protections in the Midwest. And then finally, if you want to learn a little bit more about the work that we do and ways that you can support it, you can head to savingcranes.org. One way that you can get involved in cranes this year that we're always looking for volunteers for is our annual Midwest Crane Count. It's coming up on Saturday, April 15th, 2023 from 5:30 to 7:30 in the morning. You can get more information about it on our website, but it's essentially this statewide or really Midwest-wide crane count in the morning to see how many cranes are coming through certain areas. Even if you see 0 cranes while you're out on your crane count, you get to see a sunrise over a marsh, which is a pretty exciting experience as well. And that's also incredibly important data for us to know if cranes aren't using spaces or if cranes are moving into areas. Finally, I do want to wrap up my presentation by inviting you to come and visit us at the International Crane Foundation. We are the only place on Earth where you can see all 15 species of cranes. We recently underwent a renovation and reopened our crane gates just last year, so if you've seen us before, we may look just a little bit different. We are open from May 1st through October 31st, so there's just about a month left of our open season. We're open from 9 to 5 every single day. You can see our exhibit spaces, some of our wonderfully accessible hiking trails. We have a prairie loop, a wetland loop, and a forested loop as well. We have some wonderful roving naturalists and volunteers that'd be happy to tell you a little bit more about cranes. And on the weekends, we offer free public tours if you're interested in those as well. But I would like to open it up to any questions that you might have for me, and thank you all for coming out to learn a little bit more about the cranes we have here in Wisconsin. Yes.
Yeah, I've been watching, been going on for years where I used to work, that there was always Sandhills, always raising little ones. This year they had a pair, raised them all, and they almost look like mom and dad now. But when do they do their first flight, that they actually fly off?
Yeah, so they'll fly off right around mid-October. We actually had just today the very first whooping crane migrated down to southern Illinois. So maybe picking up a little bit earlier this year. We're not quite sure why that bird left, but it typically starts mid-October, peaks in November, and then ends around end of December. And most of them here in Wisconsin, they're going to go kind of southeast, curve right along Chicago and Lake Michigan, and either stop in that northern Indiana area, or they're going to head all the way down to northern Alabama as well with our whooping cranes.
If they decide to migrate.
Yeah, if they decide to. The only place that we've seen that cranes don't leave here in Wisconsin is right around Dane County. And we really think that's because of all of the food resources they get by staying close to the Madison area that you're really just not seeing throughout the rest of Wisconsin.
I was told that they're part of the migration, and I'm assuming it was Sandhill Crane. Occurs on the Platte River.
Yeah, so both Sandhill Cranes and whooping cranes can migrate through on the Platte River in Nebraska, and that's going to be, for our Sandhill Cranes and for our whooping cranes, they're not the population that comes through Wisconsin. For the whooping cranes, it's going to be that large historic population, and you can see that in the Platte River at Kearney, Nebraska. It's called the Sandhill Crane Capital of the World. I forget how many Sandhill Cranes you can see there. I believe it's about 600,000 will come through. And you'd think it would make it easier to see the whooping cranes because there's about 500 in that flock, but they're just so massively inundated by Sandhill Cranes, it makes it so much more difficult. But we always say, if you are interested in going out to see them, you can definitely see them on St. Patrick's Day each year. That's usually right around peak migration time. You can also see migrating cranes here in, well, not here, but a little bit north in Baraboo. The International Crane Foundation and Aldo Leopold Foundation, we're putting on our very first Midwest Crane Fest, and we're kind of replicating what they do in Kearney, Nebraska by setting up the blinds, going out to see cranes, and that should be around November 10th through 13th, but I may be a little bit off on those dates, but it is on our website, and could be a tiny Platte River replica, but I would recommend heading out to the Platte if you want to see an insane amount of Sandhill Cranes where their calls and their wing flaps is going to kind of reverberate through your whole body. They do call it one of the greatest wildlife spectacles on Earth.
We've observed sandhills in the local neighborhood fairly often. My workplace before I retired some years ago, sandhills used to stand on the islands in the parking lot.
Yep.
They seem to be pretty comfortable with the moving around of traffic or moving around people. For instance, I think just within the last year, there were 3 in the front yard along a local neighborhood street, and earlier this fall, there were another pair that we also passed in a lawn in a local neighborhood. It's really kind of surprising to be in such close contact with sandhill.
Yeah. So a lot of people get very excited about seeing Sandhill Cranes in their yard, and I will admit it does feel exciting to see them, but it's actually incredibly dangerous for them to be in those spaces. It increases their likelihood of colliding with cars, of having human-wildlife conflicts, and having very big negative feelings towards Sandhill Cranes, which can also be detrimental for the future of whooping cranes, because those feelings can translate very quickly. And one reason that these Sandhill Cranes are moving into cities or moving into lawns and crossing the road more frequently is unfortunately a lot of people feed Sandhill Cranes out of their backyard. So one way that you can protect Sandhill Cranes is by not feeding them in your backyard. Don't toss them corn, don't try and lure them closer to you. If you can tell your neighbors, if they're receptive to hearing that, ask them to stop feeding the Sandhill Cranes too. It really is important for their survival here, but also for people in Wisconsin to continue to have positive interactions with the Sandhill Cranes and the wildlife they have here in their state. Yeah.
Tell me about how a person becomes like a parent and wears that costume.
Yeah.
Is that like a full job or?
For some people it is. Most people at ICF have put on that costume. I've worn the costume many times. I will say it's exciting for about 5 minutes, and then it's very, very hot. And you can't really move, and you can't drink water, because whooping cranes aren't going to drink out of a water bottle, especially not through, a little hood on your head. But we have interns that actually come in every year. They come in right when the chicks are about to hatch, and then they're still with us now, and they're helping with a lot of our releases. We typically have around 5 interns where this is their full-time job, where they are playing Mama Crane and they're kind of tapping each other out, giving them breaks. So there's always a costume out with these chicks, almost 24/7 when they're really young. And then after that, there's a costume out with them between kind of the normal daylight hours, and then they'll roost and sleep at night without a costume. But yeah, our aviculture staff who do a lot of that captive crane care, they put on the costume sometimes. Our field staff, they put it on. And then when we're short-staffed for a day, they will tap anybody who's in an office and ask you to put a crane costume on to go help raise the chicks. So it's very exciting. We also do frequently take volunteers. If they're trained, they can also wear the costume too. Of course, we aren't taking volunteers right now because our chicks are either already released or going to be released this week or next week. So we're saying goodbye to our birds here pretty soon now. Yeah.
We see them staging near Spring Reef. Are there better places to see when there's the big groups of them ready that are staging to head south?
Yeah. One of the best places to see the staging of Sandhill Cranes is just outside of Baraboo, right along the Wisconsin River. It's not very predictable where they're going to stage, but following the Wisconsin River are some of the greatest places to see those Sandhill Crane stagings here in the Midwest. You're not typically going to see a lot of whooping cranes too, because again, you're never going to see all 80 in one place at the same time. You will, though, sometimes see a family of 4 kind of pop in with that group of Sandhill Cranes, but you'll see the whole time they're kind of pecking and keeping the Sandhill Cranes at bay, because they don't really want to spend time with them, but they do want to share the food resource and have kind of the safety of a flock. So you might see a little group of whooping cranes kind of waddling through as well. Awesome. Oh, yeah.
So I know there's been a proposal in the legislature through the years about hunting Sandhill Cranes. Where's that at right now? Has that been introduced?
Yeah, so currently the decision is up to the legislature, but that doesn't mean that your voice can't still be heard. We are still asking that if it's something that you oppose, to let your legislators know, be loud, keep reminding them. It's not something that we want to see passed here in Wisconsin. The decision was tabled, but they're going to bring it back up again here in the fall and start discussing it again as well. The decision is not up to the International Crane Foundation, unfortunately. We would say no immediately. But one of the ways that we're trying to prepare, worst case scenario, is by getting a lot of our information out and kind of front-loading people with that information about whooping cranes, because one of our biggest concerns is there being incidental take of whooping cranes here in Wisconsin. We haven't seen cases of mistaken identity in the states where Sandhill Cranes are shot on their wintering grounds, but Sandhill Cranes and whooping cranes, well really whooping cranes in general in winter, look very different than they do in summer. The adults are going to look the same throughout the year, but the juveniles that we have here in Wisconsin, they are 5 feet tall just like their parents when they're only 3 months old. They're a full cinnamon throughout their body with a little bit of white feathers, and that looks much more similar to a Sandhill Crane than this bright white bird that we have here, and our concern is the loss of juveniles from that mistaken ID.
Why is there such a big loss of whooping cranes, but not Sandhill cranes?
Yeah, so to start off, whooping cranes are much more wetland dependent. So by losing that wetland habitat, they sustained a far greater loss than our Sandhill cranes. And also to start, whooping cranes were never quite as numerous as Sandhill cranes. So today we have 800,000 Sandhill cranes. They're very common, and they used to be very common as well. But our whooping cranes, the largest reported number for them was just about 100,000 whooping cranes. And that's not very large compared to our Sandhill cranes. So they were never an incredibly numerous species, but they were definitely much more numerous than they used to be. Also being large white, they're a much bigger, kind of easier target for that millinery trade and for that legal or unregulated hunting as well. Awesome. Well, if there aren't any further questions, thank you guys again for coming out. If you'd like to see some of the crane artifacts we have up here, you're free to kind of tinker around with this and try on the whooping crane puppet. Then we also have some handouts in the back. One of our handouts is a $1 off coupon to come visit the International Crane Foundation. If you will notice on the back, it does say it's expired. We printed a ton of them, and then the pandemic hit, and then our opening was delayed, and we have so many, so we will continue to acknowledge them and still let you in with that $1 off coupon, despite it looking like it's not valid anymore. All right, thank you.